We're ready to start in chapter 4. It might be good, though, to remind ourselves that the chapter divisions and the verse divisions were something that was introduced later to just help the student to be able to find their place in the letters. But when James wrote this letter, it was just a long letter, no divisions in it at all. So sometimes when we're starting a new chapter, we think the subject is changing. It's a very different thing that's going to be discussed. In this case, it's not true that the chapter division is in a place where maybe it's convenient for some purposes, but the discussion really continues, and that is the exercise of true wisdom, heavenly wisdom, as compared to wisdom that comes from below. He starts off by asking a question. James does that a lot, not expecting people to answer. He's writing a letter to them, but he'll ask a question to help them think, and then he will answer the question for them. The question he starts with in chapter 4 is, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Interesting question. What is our usual answer to such a question? Well, I got into this argument, I got into this fight because of what they did, because of what they said. Always our inclination, our temptation is to blame it on someone else. When we lose our temper, when we become argumentative, and display these kinds of qualities. He says, no, it's not true. He says, what causes fightings and quarrelings among you? He answers the question, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? Remember in chapter 1, he was talking about temptations. And he was teaching that temptations come from within us. Not to think that God might be tempting us. He says God does not tempt us to do evil. Temptations and sin come from our evil desires, that when they then produce action, they conceive sin, and sin, when it grows up, is full grown, brings forth death. It's the same idea right here. It's our desires that are within us, covetous, strong desires. He says in verse 2, you want something, but you don't get it. You kill and covet, but you cannot have what you want. You quarrel and fight. Oh, think about it. Killing and coveting. He's writing here to Christians. Is it possible that even among Christians there could be killing and coveting? Well, it is possible. Do we think for a moment that throughout the centuries that it has not happened? Do we think for a moment that a Christian has never become filled with rage, filled with evil intents, hatred, bitterness, and even perhaps committed murder? I think probably it has happened. But James may be using the idea in a bigger sense also. Jesus was speaking in the Sermon on the Mount, and he said, you have heard that it was said of old time, thou shalt not kill. But I say unto you, Jesus is speaking here, but I say unto you, then it goes on to explain that when we have bad will, when we have anger toward a brother, when we call them a fool, when we despise them, is the idea that he's speaking of, is just as if we committed the sin of killing. That we are in danger of the judgment, is the way he says it. So, killing in a real physical way, or killing with our words and our hatred and our bitterness. It doesn't really matter in terms of both our sin. Both are sin. We need to guard against them. He keeps talking about these desires we have in us. We want things, we can't get them. He says, you do not have because you do not ask God. Now he's going to talk more about that too. But isn't that true sometimes? That some things, if we would just ask God, He would be happy to give them to us, happy to help us along our way. But we just simply don't ask. But then he continues this thought, and he says, but when you ask, he says, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. Selfishness. When you think about selfishness, isn't it the root of so many problems? Think even of the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. Well, would I kill a person if I were treating them the way I would like to be treated? Would I steal from a person? Would I take another person's wife if I were treating them the way I would like to be treated, instead of indulging my selfish desires without regard to them and their feelings, without regard to how God looks at it and how He labels it sin? Think of a parent with a child. A parent may have a young child, and the child is frequently asking for things from the parent. Would it be a good thing for the parent to always give the child everything that they ask for? Every time that they ask for help, some other child has a toy, and our child wants it. Our child says, Dad, Mom, please help me get that toy. And we go take it away from another child to give it to our child. Would that be a good thing? To always be indulging that kind of behavior? Well, we can readily see it would not be. So it is. If we are always asking God for things simply to indulge our desires, simply to indulge our pleasures, always being selfish, then God is not going to answer those prayers. Well, He will answer the prayers, but the answer will be, no, I am not going to give you everything you ask for when you are just trying to indulge yourself, please yourself, and be selfish in your nature. Sometimes it's helpful to me to think about it this way. There have been some days in my life, maybe a lot of days, when it was almost like I was thinking, I am the center of the universe. All the universe is here to please me. People should be doing what I want them to do. The weather should be what I want it to be. And if people are not doing what I want them to do to make me happy, to make me comfortable, then I am thinking, this is so bad. They are not acting the way they want to, the way I want them to act. I am going to put pressure on them. Maybe I'm going to become angry with them. I am going to try to make them act the way I want them to act. I am the center of the universe. Well, when we talk about it like that, it is very easy for us to see that that is not a good way to live. That is the epitome of selfishness. And it's never going to work, because what about the people around me? Well, if they are also thinking they are the center of the universe and I should be doing everything to please them and this other person and this other person, well, it cannot work, can it? But if we as a people are considering each other's needs, considering each other's desires, trying to look for ways to help each other, that can work and work well. I get some of my needs met. I get some of my even selfish desires met. And even while I am helping other people and meeting their needs, and their desires, maybe sometimes even selfish desires. That is what can work, and that is how God will bless us. If we are trying to be a blessing in other people's lives, and we pray for God's help to do that, He will be answering our prayers with a yes. I am happy to help you. Sometimes I think about it even with the blessings that we have in terms of money or possessions. If we are willing to share and distribute, as is sometimes talked about in the Bible, distribute or share with other people, then that is serving the purpose of God, and God will be very helpful to us, and very anxious to be helpful to us, because He'll see that as He blesses us, we're a blessing to other people. Well, so it is in all of life, not just money and possessions, but in all of life. Oh, that's not the way it was so much, though. He begins verse 4 in a surprising way. He says, "You adulterous people." Oh, if James were to walk into the room today and look at us and say, "You adulterous people," we would say, "No, not I. I'm not committing adultery." But what he's talking about is this. He explains in the next few verses, reminding us that when we become Christians, we have a covenant relationship with God. Just as if when we take a wife or a husband, we make a covenant with them that we'll be married to them and will be helpful and faithful to them. So it is with God. We have a covenant relationship with God. But when I turn from it and I begin to have relationships with sinful people or engage in sinful practices, he says, in this context, he says, if I choose to be a friend of the world, then in fact I become an enemy of God, because I am violating His covenant. I am becoming guilty of adultery in terms of compromising that covenant, because I want these other things. I want to engage in selfish behavior. I want to do things that He has labeled sin. He says, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble, in verse 6. I need to be humble both in terms of toward God, realizing He is so much greater than me and that His love is so much greater than mine. And I need to be willing to submit to other people also and not be filled with pride. Let's think for a moment about this idea of sin. Sin. God has called a number of things sin, quite a few things. And at first, when I thought about it, when I was thinking about becoming a Christian, I was thinking, why is He calling some of these things sin? Some of these things look like they might be a pleasure or a good thing to do. Why does He label them sin? Only later did I begin to realize that He calls some things sin because they are damaging. It's like He's putting a warning sign on this action or thing because it will not work well in our lives. It doesn't reflect love, mercy, justice. Instead, it causes damage in relationships and damage to other people. It's somewhat like driving a car and you see a sign that is a danger sign. It says, watch out, there's a curve coming, you need to slow down or you will have an accident. Well, He has labeled some things sin for our benefit so that we will understand that there is danger in the thing. And even though the sin might provide a moment's pleasure, a moment's satisfaction, that in the bigger context, in our lives and the lives of those people around us, that it will not work well. He explains then in the next few verses how when we do sin, or when people around us are sinning, It's something to be very sad about, even to grieve, even to mourn, not to take lightly and maybe be laughing about. He talked about such a thing, well, the Apostle Paul did in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. There was a man in the congregation that was committing a grievous sin, and the congregation was making light of it. The Apostle Paul said to them, you should be grieving about it. You should be mourning about it. It's not something to be laughed about and taken lightly. This is what James is saying here. Sin is a serious thing. Then for a moment he returns to the tongue. Verse 11 he says, brothers, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against his brother or judges him speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you're not keeping it, but you're sitting in judgment on it. That's not a good thing, is it? He reminds us that there is only one legitimate lawgiver, and that is God in heaven. Slandering one another, speaking against one another, it causes so much damage. I have a thought I'd like to share with you, a way of expressing how we should act that might be helpful to you. It goes like this. Never criticize anybody for anything unless I know that my Lord wants me to do it. There are some circumstances where we need to criticize or correct people. Think of a parent and a child. Well, certainly the parent sometimes needs to correct the child. Between Christians, sometimes if we see somebody becoming involved in sin, we need to go to them and rebuke or correct or help them. But most of the criticisms that we speak in our lives do not fall in the category of being something that the Lord wants us to say. So I like to think, first of all, never criticize anybody for anything. That being a first principle, and then thinking about, does the Lord really want me to do it in this case? And if He does, of course, to do it. But in the last few years, as I have tried to live by this principle, I have, I think, noticed that I am becoming a less critical person. And I'm not even having the thoughts as often as I used to. At first, it was stopping them from coming out of my mouth. Now, I hope, I think, that less often is the thought even occurring to me in my heart. So I think it's a good practice. Jesus said to treat each other the way we want to be treated. Well, I don't like the idea that people would be criticizing me frequently and without the need for it to happen. I like to think that they are filled with mercy and trying to overlook my faults, not trying to notice my faults and criticize me or be talking to someone else and criticizing me. So I need to treat other people the same way and not be criticizing them unless it is necessary. But instead, be anxious to forgive, anxious to overlook one another's faults, anxious to realize that we're just people, we make mistakes, and then just go on and think well of the person. As James continues to write in chapter 4, he changes the subject just a little bit in verse 13. And he says, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. He says, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist, a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast and brag. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. He's addressing the idea that we sometimes feel very confident of what we can do. We feel very confident of living the next day, the next year, maybe the next 20 years. He says we do not even know whether we will be living tomorrow or not. We don't even know if we are living, what will happen. Things happen all the time. It catches us by surprise. Sometimes people get up in the morning and they are thinking, I'll go do my job, I will make some travel and do some business, I will go visit somebody, and just assuming that the time is there, the opportunity will be there. We're being reminded here that life is very brief and life is very uncertain. Life is but a vapor or a mist. Sometimes in the morning we get up and it's misty or foggy outside, and we think, oh, an hour, just a little while, and it will probably be cleared away. Well, life is like that too. Not very long and not very certain. He wants us to be mindful of the uncertainty of what will happen in our lives, the uncertainty of how long our lives will last, so that we will live each day in a better way. At the end of this passage I just read, he said if someone knows to do good and doesn't do it, it's sin. If we know something that we should do today to help someone else, to do something good, today is the day that we have. To think that, oh, I might do it tomorrow, next month, next year. Well, maybe if we are living, maybe if the other person is living, maybe if we have the ability to do it. Life is so uncertain. He wants us to conduct our business in a very significant way of knowing that God is involved in our business. He wants us to be reminded that we may feel sometimes like we have control, but we don't have control. Life is very uncertain. What other people will do is very uncertain. Many times people place their confidence in riches and wealth. But riches and wealth can be like a vapor also. One day you have them, and the next day you don't. And Jesus spoke a lot about this in the Sermon on the Mount, trying to get people to realize that it's a mistake to place confidence in riches, that we should be laying up our treasure in heaven, not upon the earth. The treasure we have here on earth, if we are blessed with treasure, is treasure granted by God to be used in such a way as to glorify God. And we have no security in it. We might think that, well, I have enough that if I grow old, I'll be able to pay for people to help me until the day I die. Or we might think that if I am threatened by other people, I have enough money that I could even hire someone to stay with me and provide security for me. Or we might think, if I become sick and I need expensive doctors and hospitals, well, I can pay for them. I have security because I have wealth. Well, we don't have any such security. It is true that wealth can be helpful as long as we have it and have the opportunity to use it, that is true. The Proverbs teach that it's true, that wealth can be like a wall of security, but not in the bigger sense. Our Lord wants us to realize that we are dependent upon Him, that we may live or we may die. Jesus told a story, a parable, about a man that was very wealthy. That year he had a bountiful crop. He looked at his crop and he thought, I cannot store all of the crop that I am getting this year. I need to build bigger barns so that I can store more of my wealth in the form of grain. What Jesus said was that the Lord said to him, Thou fool, this very day your life will be required of you. He was going to store it up for himself so that he would be able to enjoy the riches of it for many days, even years perhaps, in his life. He could never have eaten it all himself. He didn't need it for himself, but he was just gaining more and more treasure to feel more secure, more important, more wealthy. James may have been talking about such people when he's talking about business people that say, I will go and I'll do this, and I will get much gain from doing it, and perhaps they too are thinking in very selfish ways, just getting more and more for selfish indulgence. And he wants them to be reminded that they don't even know if they will be alive tomorrow, that all of life is very uncertain. And really, it's how we live life, being well-pleasing in the sight of God, that improves the quality of our life here on earth and lays up the treasures in heaven, as Jesus spoke. Our lifetime here on earth is so short. Even if we live to be 50, 60, 80, even 100 years old, our life is so brief when we think about it in relationship to eternity. So, even if we have to pay a big price here on earth in terms of sacrificing or sharing what we have, even if it stretches our ability to do it, we're here for just a short time, and we want to prepare so that we can enjoy an eternity in heaven with our Lord. If we have something good to do today and we don't do it, it's a sin, he says in the last verse. Let us not pass up opportunities to do good while we're here on earth, while we have the opportunity, that we may glorify God and spend an eternity with Him.